We're live. Well, good evening, Carlos.
Good evening, Margaret.
It is 10 p.m. here in Atlanta. It's 7 p.m. where you are. And to all of our audience, wherever you're watching us from, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. You're watching Stand Up Fight Back, where we discuss strategy and analysis for the progressive movement. I'm Margot Paez, and this is my co host, Carlos Marroquin. He is an amazing grassroots organizer, and I am a scientist, engineer, and occasional journalist. We are going to be discussing today the latest IPCC report, Carlos, and even though there's a smile on my face, it's nothing to smile about. It's pretty bad.
It is bad. Maybe can we switch the.
Yeah, hang on a second.
There we go.
Let me check that.
It's
All right.
right there in my end. But good evening, everybody, wherever you may be watching us from. I am here in Southern California. Margaret is, of course, over in Atlanta, Georgia. But it is a beautiful Sunday evening here in Southern California. The sun is still out. It was a very warm weekend, and a lot of stuff happening. A lot of stuff happening here in Southern California. But of course, tonight's focus will be on climate change and the recent report that came out. Outrageous because I don't think governments are taking this too serious. At least some of the stuff that we are seeing and hearing is really alarming, concerning, and we're gonna dive into some of that report today.
Yeah. So this is the latest IPCC report. That's Working Group 3. So this report that just came out last week is on mitigation, which means how to reduce the effects of climate change. The report that came out a few weeks ago prior to this one was the Working Group 2, which was on adaptation. So that one was about adapting to the existing changes in the environment due to the already created warming, global warming. So we've warmed the planet so far 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And now this report is telling us, based off of our business as usual, if we continue on as we are doing with the existing policies, we're not only going to blow through 1.5 degrees Celsius, we're going to blow through 2 degrees Celsius and take us on a path towards 3 degrees Celsius warming. So a couple of degrees doesn't sound so bad, right? Because if I don't turn on my AC and it's 75 degrees, well, before when I had the AC and I turn it off and it warms a couple of degrees, let's say to 78, that doesn't feel so bad, right? That doesn't seem so bad, but that's not exactly how it works, because this is a global average of warming. So some parts of the planet are warmer than other parts already, including the polar cap. So like the Arctic and the Antarctic, those polar regions are warming much faster. We're talking about, 5 degrees, 7 degrees warming on those scales. Not only that, our land mass on land, it's warming faster than on the oceans, on the surface of the oceans. So this is just an average of global temperature. And not only that, our planet, the habitability of this planet, and which means how hospitable it is to life, is very sensitive. In when we look at exoplanets and we're looking to see if they can host life on those planets, we look for something called the Goldilocks zone. And in the Goldilocks zone is a very sensitive region in which life can exist. So having 2 degrees warming, 3 degrees warming is an absolute nightmare for our planet and for all species on this planet. So that's why we have to prevent warming at this level. And the IPCC report is saying that we are not working hard enough to do that. And by we, Carlos, we're talking about governments. governments are not working hard enough. They're still allowing fossil fuels to come online, and that's a really big problem.
Right. And it was concerning because last last Sunday, just prior to them releasing the report, governments governments, including the United States, enter into negotiations with the scientists, with the people that were issuing the report, negotiation on the language that they wanted to use. That's alarming because pretty much they were saying, we're going to let the report go out and we're going to go ahead and agree with some of this report, but language will be a problem for us. And the reason why it's alarming is because they want to be able to water it down as much possible, and they want to be able to spin it, as to not giving the seriousness that it deserves. Scientists that were pretty much were issuing a last warning report. They were sounding the alarm and saying it's gotten to the level of no return. If we proceed moving from this day forward, after we issue the report, in the same path that we're going, it's irreversible. It's completely irreversible. Governments had an issue with that. They didn't want to hear that. So they were saying pretty much, this is the language that we want you to use.
Yeah, so there were a couple, I don't know, a handful of governments that were opposed to some of the language because it affects the fossil fuel industry in their countries, especially around coal. So that, I think, was the big problem. But that language is actually, I think, in the document that's for the policymakers. But if you go through the actual IPCC report, that the language there is very clear. So if you look at the technical report, you'll see that the scientists that worked very hard on this, they worked also very hard to make sure that that was not watered down. So I really recommend going through some the more technical reports as well to balance out the policymaker report or the press releases that come out, because that's really where all the real details are about how serious this is. But yeah, absolutely, Carlos. I mean, the fact even then, right, even if it's in just one, the most, in one public facing aspect of this report, it still says a lot about what our policymakers are thinking right now, when we already know that we are at serious risk of harming all species on this planet. And the thing that you have to understand is that around 2 degrees Celsius is when you start to get these tipping points. And we don't actually know where the tipping points are. We don't even know if we've started on any of these tipping points have started to happen. So that's why it's so important, because these type of tipping points, when they happen, they start these feedback loops, these positive feedback loops that then release more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere or more methane into the atmosphere. And so you end up creating this runaway warming that goes beyond just the fossil fuels that we are already that we are burning, that are already emitting carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. So that's the problem, and that's the danger, and that's why we are putting entire, every species on the planet at risk. And this IPCC report, I mean, I think what really stood out to me about the IPCC report this time around is that they did not hold back on the trajectory that we're going. Whereas in the past, I found that some of these reports have been more hesitant to say, like, we have certain models, we think, we could go this path, we could go this path. But in this case, they were really upfront, like, we're going to blow through 1.5, we're going to blow through 2 degrees, and we're on our way to 3 degrees by the end of the century. That's pretty serious. I mean, that's a outright statement that, look, there, you can't sugarcoat it. We're in trouble.
Right. Exactly. I mean, we cannot sugarcoat climate change at all. because it's very real. When we're talking about the water crisis that we are facing because of climate change, when we see the patterns that year after year continue to increase, causing great harm to regions, to entire regions of the globe, that is causing people to even flee, to migrate to other countries. We're talking about, massive movement of people that are affected by climate change. It's like you cannot sugarcoat that anymore. And when we continue in the same trajectory and the same path of using the same how do you call it, systems that are depleting and taking away from our from from the things that we need to do the opposite, is like is alarming, because we got to get away from fossil fuels. We just got to get away from that. And right now there's an opportune time to do it, you know, especially with everything that's going on in the world, including the war. You know, we see how Europe is depending so much on oil for certain, from the Russian oil, for example. It's like, when are we going to learn that there's other great options to have energy, and that we do less damage and harm to the world, to Earth, Mother Earth.
Right. Yeah, we need to switch to other sources of energy. Absolutely. It sounds like, I mean, the solutions are there. As everyone says, the solutions are there. We know what we need to do. But unfortunately, our governments are absolutely captured by not just the fossil fuel industry, but also by the banking industry, the finance industry. And they don't have an incentive to do this shift. Their goal is to maximize profits, and they think short term. They don't think long term. For them, okay, I can extract more wealth for the next 50 years. That's fine with me. I'm going to be dead by then. Who cares? Or maybe I'll figure out a way. I'll get so rich that I'll figure out how to get off planet and go on a ship someplace else, right? And colonize some other planet. I think that some of these very rich people seriously think that, and people like Jeff Bezos, because they're not helping. They're really not. I mean, they could throw all of their money, their billions of dollars at this, and they don't. They don't. They just hoard it.
Guaranteed. And see, they're spending a lot of money to go into outer space, to look life in other planets, to see how they can sustain life in other planets. I mean, that's part of the problem, is that, instead of focusing here and fixing the things that we have here at home, in our world, and it's nothing that is not achievable. We can achieve, the goals that we set ourselves to do, if we want to. But the problem is that they don't want to. It's so much money behind climate change, so much money behind profits, that they, as you say, they only think short term. They're not looking at the long term. We're talking about your children's children that will be affected by this. We're talking about, entire regions that will become, desolate, because people cannot live there, because there's not enough water, or there's not enough, or there's floodings, So patterns are going to change if we continue in this same road to nowhere.
Yeah, Carlos, it's it's sort of, yeah, it's kind of hard to believe that we're actually at this point where scientists are going out and protesting and getting themselves arrested just to get attention to this issue, to try to get the government's attention. And that happened recently with Scientists Rebellion this past week. They had a 3-day rebellion around the world where scientists, especially climate scientists, went out and protested and locked themselves, tied themselves to buildings. In Los Angeles, there were a group from Science Rebellion who chained themselves to a Chase bank because the bank's fund so much of these, they fund these fossil fuel operations that the big banks do. They're complicit in this. And it got very little news coverage in the United States. I think in the UK it got more coverage. The UK media seems a little more responsive to these protests, but in the United States, this is very little. I mean, you sent me that KTLA report, and that's actually, I think, the first piece of news coverage that I saw of that protest. And they didn't interview anybody there. It
Yeah,
was just a very brief thing. Well, protesters have chained themselves to a Chase bank, and that was it. It was a helicopter coverage of it, and nothing else. And one of the protesters there is a scientist. His name is Peter Kalmus. He's a scientist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he was really surprised how little coverage it got. He thought that the media would turn out, or they would want interviews because they were arrested, and it should be a big deal, right? I mean, scientists in general are not political. They're fairly apolitical, and I can tell you just from my experience being at a university that is made up of scientists and engineers, it's very hard to get them to show up to a protest. They're not interested in protesting like you might find on a liberal arts college. It's just part of the culture. They're folk that researchers in science engineering are generally trained to be more focused on the research, ignore all the external noise, just show up and do your work. And they don't really show up to these kinds of things. So to see scientists feeling like they have to do this really shows the desperation at this point because of how serious climate change is and how little is being done. There's certainly a shift in terms of how renewable energy is starting to come onto the grid. We are seeing that, and the projections are good that the energy is moving in the right direction, moving away from fossil fuels to at least moving towards bringing more renewable energy online. But with all of those trillions of subsidies that the fossil fuel industry gets, I mean, you're still fighting a pretty big battle there. A lot of that industry is propped up just out of necessity in some ways too, because our whole society is coupled to fossil fuels. And Carlos, I don't think people really realize how much our lives are tied to fossil fuels. It's not just the electricity production, it's our cars, it's our clothes, it's our furniture, it's our dishes, our utensils, tents. It's everything. It's cement, it's an infrastructure, all aspects, all levels of our society. It's agriculture. The production of fertilizer is tied to natural gas. I mean, every element of our society has become intertwined with fossil fuel production. And that's partly why this is so hard to do. And because we don't have the conversation that is needed around this to mobilize this shift, it's an incredible uphill battle to get this change to happen. And I think, if the public is not aware and the government isn't doing what is necessary, we're not going to get to that goal that we all want, those of us who are aware, which is to prevent warming from going beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. But right now we're so distracted. I personally I'm not that optimistic that we're going to make it.
And Margaret, there are people out there that are fighting, for climate change.
Mm-hmm.
There are great organizations that have been on the front lines doing some heavy lifting when no one else wanted to hear about this. Bless you. they they've been out there in the front lines, but it's not enough. It's not enough. As you stated, media doesn't cover it as they should. We have more reporting done on Will Smith slap at the Oscars, throughout every single day, and he's gonna keep going.
Yeah.
When you compare it to the report that came out and the amount of media that Will Smith slap, put out, that tells us what the problems are. Media is part of the problem. They are not out there exposing this and really holding politicians accountable as they should.
Hmm.
We get all this, every single word that, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but almost every single word that Donald Trump comes out of his mouth, media's out there putting it out.
Yeah.
All this garbage that he puts out. But yet, they are not holding politicians accountable when it comes to climate. You don't hear those reports. There used to be that we had some reporters that were, with such an integrity, used to report news, and
Yeah.
they follow through, in their not only in their research for the truth, but also covering, making sure that all the points were put out there, were reported. We don't see that more. And everything is more about the glamour, about the moment, about ratings, and obviously, according to the media, they make it too obvious is that they rather be on that trend of the moment, rather than looking at what we need to be looking at, the thing that really affects all of our lives.
Yeah, well, it's clickbait. So that's these media outlets are all advertisement driven. So, or some of them doing subscriptions now, but it's still very much heavily advertisement driven. So they have to drive those eyes to those pages somehow. And Will Smith slapping Chris Rock is way more, I guess, entertaining than hearing about climate change. So that's unfortunate that that's how a profit model works. And I think the so many newspapers have shut down, newsrooms have shrunk over the last decade or so, and a lot of these media outlets don't have investigative desks anymore. They don't have investigative journalists anymore. So they don't even have time to do the investigations that are necessary, and I guess they don't even have time to really dig through these IPCC reports either. The adaptation report came out, I think maybe a week before Ukraine, somewhere around there. I mean, it got very little coverage. I know. I think it overlapped with the invasion of Ukraine. It got very little coverage, because they only want to talk about Ukraine. In fact, a friend and I we wrote an op-ed, and originally it was supposed to be placed in USA Today, and it was related to climate change and the environment, and they were going to run it, and then Ukraine was invaded, and they said, sorry, we can't run your piece because we're only accepting stuff related to Ukraine. I mean, it's so crazy because climate change is, really, on the scale of things, more important. And the war itself, I mean, really has to do with energy, fossil fuels, and that's tied to climate change. So it's all relevant, but there's just a completely misalignment of incentives here when your profits are tied to just whatever's the most clickbaity, articles. And so, yeah, you see Chris Rock and Will Smith all over the place, on Twitter, other social media, every newspaper or news outlet. That's what they want to talk about, because I guess that tabloids sell. But it's unfortunate because I think in a few years people are going to start really seeing the problems more and more, because we're already seeing them. And it's not just extreme weather, it's also our food chain, it's also supply chain, it's also damages to your home if you due to a fire or whatever, these are economic challenges that are facing us. But
Right.
it's also water depletion, in these increased droughts. We have now lakes that are in the southwest region that are pretty much dried up. And now that water that was important to the surrounding community is not there anymore because of the drought, and those droughts are exacerbated by climate change. There was this horrible famine in Madagascar. I mean, that stuff, yeah, it's going to get worse. The worst effects are hitting the global south first, but the north is not an exemption. It's coming here too. And in fact, we're already seeing these problems, like reduced crop yields. Like if you get a lot of flooding in the Midwest, that's going to reduce your crop yield. I mean, the stuff that's happening in Ukraine, and that's affecting the supply chain, the food chain. I mean, that's an example of what is going to happen with really bad effects of climate change. So it's coming. I mean, people are going to see this at some point, and when they do, it's going to be too late, and they're going to wish that they had done something. They're going to wish that they had changed, even if, they're going to wish that, oh, I wish I had eaten a little less meat, even, because that was a simple little thing that we could have done to reduce both methane emissions and CO2 emissions. And the latest IPCC reports over the last few years have said we must reduce methane emissions as well because of the short-term effects. So we are really missing an opportunity here. And I think that if the governments don't do anything and people don't wake up to the reality, we're facing a really, really sad future, at least until something happens. But I mean, a lot of people are going to get hurt and lifespans are going to be shortened. There's no way to say this. This is a really terrible situation that we have created for ourselves. So
Right.
I'm very doom and gloom today, and this is the reality of climate change and climate change in action.
Right. Now, there is another report that came out, and there is a projection that any inaction by our government, I'm talking about the United States here, that failing for them to act will cost about $2 trillion.
Right. Yeah.
$2 trillion. That's a lot of money.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like a lot. It's not that much on the global scale when you think about $5 trillion a year go to fossil fuel subsidies. But I actually think that these numbers are underestimated because they're based off of models that are economic models that are based in neoclassical economics, is my understanding. And I think that they're underestimating the ramifications of climate change in terms of the economic losses and the effects, the negative effects on GDP. So I expect that it's actually worse than that, and that we really have not fully assessed it. Steve Keen is an economist. He's been looking at these models and he thinks that they're just totally ridiculous. So he's been coming up with his own research and trying to come up with better models. So I suspect that we'll be seeing other economic models in the near future that suggest otherwise, that it's actually going to be worse than a couple of $1 trillion. I think it's going to be much more than that. I think it's going to be more than just 3% of GDP. It's going to be bigger than that because eventually you're not going to be able to sustain your society and you're going to have societal collapse. So you're not going to have any GDP growth. It's ridiculous. I mean, that is what we're talking about here. We're talking about societal collapse. As you approach 2 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees Celsius is not really habitable for 8 billion people. I'm sorry. It's not.
Right. Well, there was a report that came out that the United States spent $120 billion responding to the different calamities that happen, floods, the
Mm-hmm.
wildfires,
Mm-hmm.
the major storms that took place.
Mm-hmm.
That was a yearly budget of about $120 billion that was spent. And the less that we do to try to, engage the things that we need to do to alleviate, the problems with climate change, the costlier it'll become, because we're going to have more storms coming in. We're going to have more problems coming in, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, those are the things, the warning signs. And the money is going to be tight. It is already tight. And we need to think about that because at the same time, taxpayers are the ones that carry the load. And for us, failing to engage, and this is where I wanted to go with this, is that, the failure of the government to engage on climate change will be costly, but taxpayers are the one that will pay for that. So this is why it's important for us to engage in this issue, because, it's our money. We're the ones that have to pay the price for this at multiple levels. Not
Mm-hmm.
only the effects that we get to it, but also out of our pockets.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, the weight of this cost is going to fall on everybody. Absolutely. And it is taxpayer money that has to support this. I mean, you can only do so much quantitative easing to prop up the economy. So at some point that's not going to work, and it's going to cause a lot of harm to the population.
So, Mark,
So, yeah.
something I want to ask you a question, because you're a young person, and so many young people out there. I talk to a lot of young people, and they are concerned for the obvious reasons. But what are you hearing from your colleagues, from from other students, from people that you associate with?
Yeah.
What what's are they really scared, nervous? What's your feeling on this?
I think that a lot of people in my generation are sort of resigned to the reality of what's coming. I think we joke a lot about it. We joke, it's called gallows humor, you know, joking about something that's really horrible. You know, uh, basically things like, well, we might just be the last generation of humans on this planet, things like that. I mean, it's very dark because I think people don't see a high probability of governments doing what is necessary. So I think most people are resigned to not doing much. But I mean, people who do care enough to take action are doing everything they can, even against the odds. But it's still hard. I mean, you know what you're up against, and you know how hard this battle is, and you know that we may not succeed, but we have to try, and we want to win, and we do what we can to succeed, and protest and organize and try to build new communities, new ways of living outside of the existing system, and try to create a new system. I think that that's probably the most important thing that we can do. And I think that, yeah, that's really it. I think actually what surprises me though is how even young people are not very engaged either. I think with climate change, I don't see
The urgent.
people, yeah,
That's what
engaging with the urgency of it either. Yeah.
right, and that's what's troubling me, that I don't see the urgency from different groups.
Hmm.
Obviously, of course, government is not. I don't see them with the urgency that they need to have.
Hmm.
The only group that I see that have an urgency is really from the science, you know,
Community. Yeah.
community. That's the only
Yeah.
that urgency. Yes,
Yeah.
there are groups, and they sounding the alarm and they trying to mobilize, but something like this, we should have countless and countless of people, you know what I mean, ready to be pushing forward and protesting and demanding change. I don't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is that as a scientist, especially somebody who works on climate change, you're the one reading the reports, you're the one writing them. You're the one studying this stuff. So you know what's going to happen, you know what's projected if we don't change our behavior. But the thing is that scientists are studied to be scientists. They didn't study to be public speakers. They didn't study to be reporters. They didn't study to be on the news or to have that public presence to take this to do what policymakers are supposed to be doing, what political leaders are supposed to be doing. From a scientist perspective, is I do, you know, this I write this study, I do this research, I put it out there for everyone to read, and then that, you know, if it needs to be put into some sort of report to how policymakers make decisions, okay, that's great. That's all aligned within what scientists can imagine themselves doing. And then at that point, the baton is handed off to the politicians, and the scientists just expect that the politicians are going to do their job. But they're seeing a breaking point there where politicians have consistently ignored the recommendations of the scientists. So they basically realized that, you know, there's there's only we have no other option but to try to get people's attention some way or another. And it's just when you know because you read the reports. And the thing is that climate change is all based off of science, so scientists are the ones who really understand it best. I mean, that makes them feel so desperate. And the other problem is that the media should be explaining this stuff. The media, news outlets, reporters should be going to scientists and interviewing them and asking them, how do we explain this to people? This is really important. What are the steps we need to take to get people to realize the urgency of this? And the media has failed to do that. They're not engaging with scientists. They don't even bring scientists on to the news, really. Who are the scientists you see? The scientists that I remember seeing on the news, and I don't even know if they even bring them on the news anymore, were Michio Kaku and Neil deGrasse Tyson, both physicists, one a futurist, the other an astrophysicist. So they would bring him on to talk about astronomy and stuff. And Michio Kaku, wrote all these futurist books, right? That's about it. Like, you bring these science popularizers on, and they talk about like, ooh, kind of cool stuff for a few segments. But you don't really see them on there talking about climate change at all. They're just completely as if it's not even happening. And that, I think, is where the failure is. Why you don't see the urgency is because it's not being treated like that in the outlets, in the news, or in politics. And people get their information from media. So if the media isn't telling them the truth, then they're not going to feel a sense of urgency. The other problem is that people are very busy with their own lives. This society, this economic system has forced people into a mode of operation that doesn't give them time to even think about stuff like this. The most important thing for them is, am I making enough money to feed myself and my kids? Am I making enough money to have a roof over my head this month or next month? Am I making enough money to pay off my debt? No, that's what our lives have become in the United States, especially. And they don't have time to stop and think about it. And then rich people, well, they just like their comfy lives, and they have no incentive to change. So they don't have an incentive to stop using these yachts, or private jets. A lot of them don't. And so we have a completely broken society, a completely broken economic system, a completely broken government, and I don't think that's a coincidence either. I think that there is a connection between all of this and the fact that climate change has gone to be what it is. I don't think a functioning society would have let climate change get this far without doing anything about it. we've known about climate change. We've known about how bad it could get since at least the 80s in terms of certainty. But going back further than that, there were studies that suggested that this could happen. But I mean, in the 80s, we really felt pretty confident about the science. So we've had close to 40 years to figure this out, and we haven't done it. Only society that I can think of that cannot act on something as urgent as this is a society that is broken. So I don't think that this is a coincidence that climate change is, that we are where we at right now with climate change. I don't even think we would have gone to this point if we had a functioning society. And part of that is, I think, neoliberalism, everything that happened after we came off of the gold standard, and the coupling of the dollar with the oil industry and all of these wars, and then this whole make the market the central aspect of society, all of that, I think, is just all connected to us being at this point today. So yeah, I mean, neoliberalism, what it did was it basically made a race to the bottom in terms of labor costs. So it opened up all these labor markets, increased competition amongst people in the labor markets, and driving prices down in terms of how much you cost to perform this task, right? You have to think of yourself as a product. Like, you look at the cost of mass production of something like computers, and over time they go down, like solar panels, for example. The price of solar panels have gone down over the last 30 years, right? And people are like products in this economy, and your price has gone down too. Your value has diminished because the market is a global market for people to work, and that priced us out, priced people out in the US out of manufacturing, and you're replaced with a cheaper product in China, right, or in India. You can mass produce Chinese and Indian people, right? I say that joking, it sounds terrible, but that is really how the market looks at you as a person in this neoliberal market system. So this is all a big, I think, from the big picture scale, it's just the entire system. Social, climate change is the greatest failure. It's the greatest market failure. And what neoliberalism wants to do is to fix it with the market. For the most part, you can't fix a nightmare that neoliberalism created. You can't fix a nightmare that capital accumulation created with more capital accumulation and more neoliberal policies. And that's part of the problem. So it's just the whole system. It's everything. It's one giant failure, and it's all going in the same direction. And the question is really, can we at least ramp up our renewable energy transition? Can we at least do that? Can we at least electrify? Can we at least get the grid to be 100% renewable or close to 100% renewable, enough to bring down to reduce those CO2 emissions, so we don't need to have that much carbon capture removal? That's the question. How much can we do under this very difficult situation?
Well, IPCC did say it on the report that cities need to be engaged in this, fully engaged, especially big cities like Los Angeles, New York, many others, to tackle climate change by retrofitting buildings, by taking necessary steps to reduce the kind of damage that cities are producing, all over the globe. So cities do, should be engaged in this. Also,
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Understand the most, because when there's catastrophes, cities can lose a lot of money really quickly, and the harm that it does to the citizens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is an important point, that we actually, if we want some change, I think we really need to engage at the city level. and just work from the bottom up. And we've talked about this before, Carlos, that we really need direct action at the local level to make this change. And we need to stop waiting for the federal decisions to be made at the federal level. We have to do it at the local level. And yeah, let's start retrofitting our city buildings. Let's pass ordinances in our cities. Maybe we pass ordinances that encourage bike riding, that limits driving in the downtown areas of our towns. We can do stuff like that, and we can reduce emissions that way. Maybe we figure out a way as a city to create a fund that will that we can then use to fund, to pay for building out solar panels on all of the homes in our town. We can still figure it out. And if we want to have a role in it, it has to be at that scale, I think. And we can do it. We just have to be engaged, and we need enough people in every neighborhood town to do it.
According to the report, 72% of the world's emissions in 2020 came from big cities.
70, how many? 72?
72%. That's a huge number. You know, yeah. I see here in Los Angeles, I see buildings popping up everywhere. You know, they developing all kinds of buildings and everything. And I don't see them taking the necessary steps to reduce the emissions.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a really excellent point, Carlos, because there is a battle, I think, in the US between rural and urban cities, between the cities and the rural parts of the country. And I think that people in the rural parts of the country really resent being told what to do by people in the city who are really importing all of their efforts and are really the ones that are creating a lot of the damage. And I think people in the city don't realize either how expensive and consuming their lifestyles are. And it's a completely different world to live in the rural parts of the United States versus a city like Los Angeles, San Francisco, or New York. And so, that number is honestly, it's bigger than I thought, but it says a lot. And I'm not too surprised, actually, in context. So yeah, let's take on the cities. And I think actually you can expand this out even globally, because a lot of countries, especially Europe and the United States, export their emissions. So things that are dirty producers, manufacturing that's dirty, gets done in other countries like in China or India. And so their emissions are high. But then they're not actually themselves the ones that are creating the emissions so much as it's the production of certain things, certain products that are done there that are creating the emissions. And then they're not the ones consuming those products. Those products are then exported into the rich countries. So we offset our emissions by having the production outside of our countries, and it makes it look like, oh, isn't that great? We don't really have like high fossil fuel, CO2 emissions. But the reality is that you just exported it to a different country, but you're still responsible for that because you're the one consuming those products. And I think that's the same thing, like between the rural parts of the United States and the city parts, is cities have really exported the work. They're consuming the products that are created in the rural areas and bringing them into the cities. So, but also I think, on the other hand, I think there's like way more people who live in cities, and there's a lot more driving, and there's a lot more congestion. I look in Atlanta or Los Angeles. So, there's multiple dynamics at play here, but we really, I think it would be great to address those issues in cities and take over those positions politically, take over those positions.
One of the things, Margaret, that I was looking at is being cities, especially large metropolitan cities, being able to offer free transportation.
Yeah, that would be great.
That would eliminate so much of the consumption of everyday driving by the people.
It
How
would,
electrical vehicles, right?
yeah.
I mean, they can get very creative, but the question goes, to the same thing. We have an opportunity. Will cities take, time and make efforts to take advantage of the opportunity that is presented to us right now?
Well, I think the only way to do that is for people who care about climate change to run for those local offices, to go on their city councils. And that's really doable. You can do that. You can run for those positions. It's not Congress. You don't need nearly as much money to do it. And it's so necessary. And Carlos, like, the thing is having all those cars out there, it causes a lot of accidents. Pedestrians get hit. When you take the cars out of the cities, it's a much safer environment. And something that I think would be great too is if we actually had within neighborhoods like little cafes or restaurants. You walk down your block, there's a restaurant embedded in the neighborhood itself. Just something sort of European ish. And how nice it would be where you can then be within your own community, where you have little businesses within your own community, where you can engage with the people you live around and actually form these smaller niche communities within the bigger communities.
Right.
And I think we have to think like that. How do we bring this in to our suburban areas? Because the way the suburbs are developed, it's not really a, aligned with that type of community where you have smaller towns where you have restaurants and little shops built into the neighborhoods. We have to change that. But you can change that with city ordinances. So you can incentivize that. But we need people who are thinking like this to get on the city councils.
Right.
And I have a book really quick. Let me go get it. I want to show you this
Yeah.
book. Hang on and watch the noise. Sorry.
I want to
Hey,
explain.
hang on, Carlos. Let me get up and grab this book. Give me a
Yeah.
minute.
In the meantime, I want to explain some of the thoughts that I'm thinking about regarding some of these points that Margaret is bringing to us. Is look, there's a lot of developments that are taking place right now here in Southern California. Some of the development, some of the talking points that they use in order for them to approve their projects are saying, well, we're going to be building small businesses below, and then we're going to have a 300-unit apartment building. You're defeating the whole purpose of all this. When you continue to gentrify, when you continue to take out 2 or 3 houses and put in this monstrosity of buildings, you're defeating the purpose. It doesn't matter how many small businesses you put in there. You know what I mean? We got to get that creative, but it has to be smart creative, responsible creative. That's what we need to do. It's not, I'm going to have a small business added into this huge apartment building. You are doing more damage than good. So we have to get creative, but it has to be responsible, creative.
Yes, I agree, Carlos. Absolutely. We need creativity. And I want to say this book, Murray Bookchin, The Next Revolution. Yeah, this book. I
Who's
say
I?
Murray Bookchin. He was an anarchist, but he developed some really interesting theories around social ecology and uh, basically direct democracy, taking over called radical municipality. So building out these public assemblies within your neighborhoods and basically taking over your city government, your local government, and finding ways to distribute that power again amongst the people in your community. And I think that that's really important for what we need to do in the struggle against our governments who are not acting on climate change and all of this discussion. And here's the chapters for people who might be interested, and you can see he has it right there: libertarian municipalism, a politics of direct democracy. So I think this is our playbook. We should learn as much as we can from this. And his daughter is Debbie Bookchin, and she's given a lot of talks about this. You can watch some of her talks online. And one thing that she says is that the Republicans are actually very good at this. Democrats are not so good at it, but the Republicans have been doing this. They take over their local school boards, they take over their local offices, and they change laws. They ban books that they don't like. They that's space. We need to do that too, but we need to do it in a way that benefits our ideas, which I think are better. So yeah, I highly recommend that to the viewers.
Exactly. And that's where the problems lie with this entire issue of climate change is the politics.
Mm-hmm.
Scientists are ready to go. Ideas are there. There's tremendous ideas that are being put into the table of things that we can immediately start doing. But what's holding back all this? Politics. We have the wrong people in office. We have people that give themselves and sell themselves to corporate greed, to corporate manipulation, to corporate, agendas, and that's what's really killing us. Is again, is politics. Is the political, environment that we live in that disregards science, that disregards, the urgency of climate change. So yes, definitely, we need to have people running for office that believe in science, but that are willing to also get creative with these ideas and pass city ordinances, pass
Mm-hmm.
county ordinances,
Mm-hmm.
that will pretty much push for the agenda to fight against climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree, Carlos. We need to do that. Absolutely. And I think we're out of time now. And I
Yes.
have to say, I'm a little tired. I was at a conference for 3 days and it was very, very busy. Got in yesterday. I'm still exhausted. So I'm sure I've been a little low energy today, but I'm trying my best. But I really am just ready to jump in
We really
bed.
for everything and for being here every Sunday with me, joining us. I know that people may not think so, but these are sacrifices that you're making, and we want to make sure that we're putting out as much as information as we can, possibly can, so that we understand what we need to do as a movement. But here from Hollywood, I want to say thank you. We do dedicate this program to our science community that has stood fast and has done everything they can to give that information that we need.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of people who have put thousands of scientists who have done this work and made it available to us so that we can act on it. So let's act on the science. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Margot Pius. Over here is Carlos Marroquin, and you've been watching Stand Up Fight Back, where we discuss strategy and analysis for the progressive movement. We air every Sunday at 7 p.m. Pacific Time, 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Find us on Facebook and YouTube. Make sure you subscribe. Uh, hit that subscribe button and hit follow us, share us, etc. Hit the like button, and we'll see you again next week on Sunday. Have a really great week. Bye,
Good night.
everyone. Good night. I'm going to hit my pillow right now.